Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
My name's Albert Myers, and I'm an alcoholic. By the grace of God and the fellowship of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and people like you and conferences like this, and my pretty Al-Anon wife, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink since September the 7th of 1973, and for that I'm eternally grateful. I bring you greetings from the Horizon Group in Dallas, Texas, from South Fork, Bobby and J.R. Why is it everybody always asks Sally? Seems that's been the story of my life. I want to thank Esther and the board and the committee for the privilege of having Sally and I to share at this conference. It's been just a wonderful weekend, and we're so grateful. We were met at the airplane by Bud and Bobby and Marilyn, and I know alcoholics talk funny, but have any of you talked to Marilyn lately? The really two Al-Anons came to pick up Sally, and Bud and I were just the token alcoholics riding along. And we got in the car, and we started down the highway, and I heard Marilyn say to Sally, "I have no idea where we are, but I know where we're going." And I thought, this is going to be a wonderful weekend, you know. And then yesterday we had a little free time, and Don and Joanne took us for a ride out to Wayzata and Lake Minnetonka, and it was just beautiful. I forget from time to time what kind of an architect that God really is. And we were driving along, and all of a sudden I heard Don say to Joanne, "Well, I'm going to go this way. It's a little longer, but it's shorter." And that probably explains the traditions that Doug was talking about last night. I've had some of the best psychiatrists in the world try to explain my behavior, and I want to tell you, Heather summed it up in 6 words last night. Hormones dancing. What can I say? I thought about that all night long. I had the privilege of introducing Clara Friday night. Her closest friends call her Carla. So it's been that kind of a weekend, guys. We're so grateful to be here and to be a part of, and I love your theme, pass it on and take time to care. I think that's the reason that really I'm here, is that someone took the time to pass it on. I was raised by a very loving mother and father, hard-working people. They seemed to make everybody happy but each other, and I could never figure that out. My dad had a 4th grade education and loved to hunt and fish and live off the land. And I'm an only child, an only son, and as a result, I went everywhere that my father went. And I remember, incidentally, this is kind of home for Sally and I, because although we're from Dallas, Texas right now, I'm an Iowa farm kid, born and raised down in Iowa. A lot of Iowans here, I see. Well, you'll know that in those duck blinds and in early morning in the fall, it gets rather chilly. And I remember saying to my dad one time, "I'm really cold." And part of my father's standard hunting equipment was a half pint of old Guggenheimer. And I remember my dad reaching in his hunting jacket and saying, "Take a little sip of this and you'll feel better." And he was right. You know, I took a little sip of that, and that morning I felt better. On the other hand, I was raised by a mother that cured all the illnesses of the world with a Vicks jar and a piece of flannel. And you know, when it gets cold in Iowa and you have a cold, and I remember my mother would get out that Vicks jar and just kind of start rubbing my chest and put the little flannel on there, and then just before I would go to bed, Mother would fix this hot toddy. And she would get this hot water and the sugar and the lemon and a couple fingers of 3 feathers or 4 roses or Old Crow or whatever it was, and she would put it in there and mix it all up, and she would say to me, "Take a little sip of this and you'll feel better." And I remember just before bedtime, she would let me have a little sip of this toddy, and sure enough, I just kind of break out and perspire a little bit, and then I'd go to sleep, and I would feel better. And for the most part, that's what alcohol did for me. It always made me feel better. As far back as I can remember, you know, life wasn't all that complicated for me. All I wanted really was just to have a good time and to be happy. And I think I was addicted to approval a long time before I was ever addicted to alcohol. I just wanted to be a part of. And I think when you're addicted to approval, you become very easy to manipulate. And I think you do things that you don't want to do with people that you don't necessarily want to be with in places that you don't want to go. And people talk to me about my behavior and they talk to me about my attitude long before they ever talk to me about my drinking. I remember my mother and my father saying to me, "My God, you're a hard-headed kid. Damn, you are a stubborn kid." And I remember a few instructors and some phys ed teachers and some coaches that talked to me about my behavior and my attitude long before people ever talked to me about my drinking. I drank in high school and in the service, and I remember I was in the service. I had taken my basic training in Great Lakes in Chicago and had been shipped to a base called Camp Shoemaker in California. I was in the war that Archie Bunker calls the big one, the WW2. That was my war. And I remember I got on this base with 95,000 other sailors, and the first weekend that we had liberty, we were just going to go over to a small town called Hayward, not very far away, 20, 30 miles, hitchhike over on Friday and have a good time and be back on Sunday. And I remember that we started drinking on Friday night and Saturday, and then, you know, I could relate to Don when he was talking. Somehow, the clock got fast. And it was Tuesday before I got back to the base. And I think they still call that absent without leave, don't they, Don? I forget what people get very upset about that. That's all I know. And I remember I was served this captain's mast, and I was standing before this officer. You know, we start to pick up the alcoholic scar tissue long before we recognize the disease. You know, we're dealing with a disease powerful enough to kill people that don't have it. And I remember standing there that morning and this man talking to me about my behavior once again. And he said, "Your behavior in boot camp was okay, and your behavior on the base has been relatively good." And as we talked back and forth out of nowhere, he just asked me, "By chance, do you have a problem with drinking?" I said, "That's not possible. You know, I'm 18 years old, and I'm an Iowa farm kid, and I'm away from my mother and my father, and there's a war on, and if things would just settle down and they'd stop shooting at each other, I'd go home, and I wouldn't feel the way I feel, I wouldn't be afraid the way I'm afraid, and I wouldn't drink the way I drink." And I really meant that. I somehow managed to get an honorable discharge and got out of the service, and in the fall of 1946 went back to the University of Iowa in Iowa City, which was my home. And I remember I had to take some entrance examinations, just nothing complicated, just some communication skills and some mathematical skills. And just the thought of failure bothered me again. I remember that little sense, that little thread of fear that went through my fabric, and I went across the street and I had a few drinks, and that was to become my pattern. Whenever the pain of reality was more than I could handle, I would always alter it with a drink. One night in a small Iowa tavern, I was with a fraternity brother, and we walked into this small tavern, and the betas and the thetas were having a beer party that night, and I remember that I just kind of looked across the room there, and there was Sally, and I remember just, she was the most striking, beautiful woman that I had ever seen, and she just kind of stopped my heart for a moment, and I turned to Bob and I said, "Do you know that girl over there?" And he said, "Well, that's Sally Sears from Des Moines." And you know how we alcoholics think, you know, that should be mine. So, and I just had one problem at the time. I was engaged to another girl. And that's no big deal for alcoholics. I mean, when we decide to go from there to there, we just go. We don't tell anybody. And I remember that, I somehow managed to get her telephone number, and I called, and I said, hey, I just thought we should get together. And, there was a funny thing about me at that time. I was so insecure. I didn't know anything about love or affection or functioning for the well-being of another person. I just felt that if I could capture the queen, that would make me a king. I just felt that if I could capture something good and put it under glass, you would recognize the fact that I must be good. And I spent a lot of my life like that, thinking I'll go to the right church, or I'll marry the right person, or I'll go to the right school, or I'll wear the right clothes, and that will make me a good person. Well, the interesting thing about it is I had to come to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous to find out that having a good relationship is not finding the right person, it's being the right person. My having a good love affair with Sally... My having a good love affair with Sally has very little to do with Sally. It has everything to do with my behavior. When my behavior is good, my love affair is good. When my behavior is funny, my love affair is funny. And that holds true with my job. My having a good job doesn't have much to do with my job. It has everything to do with my behavior. When my behavior is good, my job is good. When my performance is bad, my job is bad. In true alcoholic fashion, I got Sally to talk to me, and when you talk to alcoholics, you get in big trouble in a hurry. There was Liz that said, hey, we're charming, and we're cunning, and we're baffling, and we're clever, and we're slick, and we're con artists. And I got Sally, even knowing what she knew about me, to go out. And 3 weeks later, I cashed in all of my war bonds, and I bought a ring big enough to go over any finger. I called Sally at the dorm and said, would you meet me outside? And I remember being so drunk I could hardly get the car parked. And Sally came out and got in the front seat of the car. I put the ring on the wrong finger and said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could have me for the rest of your life? She said yes. I'm startled. Sobriety hasn't altered my thinking all that much. I still get in trouble in sobriety. I mean, it's a different kind of trouble, but I'm still competitive, and I'm still tenacious, and I still want it my way, Sally still hates to send me to the grocery store for a quart of milk, because that's a dangerous trip for me. Not too long ago I went, and I came home, and she said, how much was the milk? And I said, $30. I can't get those empty carts up and down the aisles without putting things in there. I mean, light bulbs and pant hangers and super glue are very important to me. I don't need them, but I'm going to need them. I'm convinced there's an alcoholic advertising executive somewhere in New York that says, if you want to sell every alcoholic in the world, just put new and improved on it. Sally and I got married, and we were just two young, frightened kids, and the approval that I needed as an individual became an approval that we were addicted to as a couple. And we wanted so desperately to be accepted by you. And I remember our parents helped us buy our first little GI house, and on the weekends we didn't have any money, and Sally and I would drive around the neighborhoods that we couldn't afford, and we'd look at your houses and the features. And I remember one day we drove by this house, and it had a red door and a brass kick plate on it. And Sally and I went home and painted our door red, and we put on this brass kick plate. And then a few weeks later, we'd roam around another neighborhood, and then we'd find some shutters that looked good on your house. And we'd go home, we'd put shutters on our house. And then we'd drive around and we'd look at your shrubbery and your landscaping. And then we'd come home and we'd buy shrubbery and we'd landscape our place to look like your place. Because Sally and I knew that one day you would drive by our house and say, boy, that's a good-looking house. And we said, should be, looks just like yours. But the trap that we were in and didn't see it was, once again we thought if we looked good on the outside, you would think we were okay on the inside. You know, we never saw the disease of alcoholism in our house from the beginning. Sally told you she never called me an alcoholic. It's such a deceptive disease that by the time it deceives you and by the time you deny it, you can look right at it and say, that's not the problem. I used to think money was my problem. I mean, my creditors never called and said, you're drinking too much. Well, I don't know about yours. They called and said, would you please send some money? You know. So we never saw the disease of alcoholism in our house. We started to have children right after the war. I don't know how it is now, but right after the war, we talked about having kids, lots of kids, 4 and 5 and 6. And when Sally was pregnant and the first child came along, I remember we used to look in these books that had all of the children's names on them, and we'd pick out 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 names. And one night we got to giggling and said, well, if we have triplets, we'll have Dick, Dork, and Dolph. We used to put it all. And we just pick out name after name, and we have 4 children. We have a daughter, Roxanne, and 3 sons, and they're just wonderful. I've always been in sales, and we've moved around a great deal, and I was working for a large corporation called Owens Corning Fiberglass, and I just received a large promotion to go to New York, and Sally and the 4 kids and myself went up to New York to look for a place to live. I don't know about your house. Every time we had an opportunity to move, I'm not aware that Sally and I ever sat down in the quietness of our kitchen and said, is this going to be a good move for us? Let's take a look at the 4 kids. Is anybody going to have to move up a grade or back a grade? I mean, is anybody going to get hurt with this move? I don't know about your house, but our alcoholic home it went like this. Sally and I would sit down and we'd say, God, we've got a chance to start over again. God, this time it's going to be different. This time we're going to keep track of all the checks in the checkbook. This time we're going to have enough bedrooms. We're going to have a big enough yard. We'll be close enough to the church. We'll be next to the school. We always look for that one tangible ingredient that we didn't have last time that we'll put in this time to make it different. And we never saw the disease of alcoholism. We moved to New York, and if you were to have stopped me on the street and say, Albert, how are things in your life? I'd have said, wonderful. I have this marvelous job with this nice corporation and this beautiful wife and these 4 kids, and we live in a lovely home up in Connecticut. And, outwardly, I really meant that. When I said that to you and looked you straight in the eye, I meant that because I had done all of the things that society had asked of me, and it should have added up. And somehow we were just bleeding on the inside, and I couldn't tell you why. I got home one Friday night, and I was drunk, and Sally made some remark as to my condition. Sally told you she was vocal. And whenever Sally would make some comment about my condition, and I knew she was right, I would go into my alcoholic sarcasm, because that was my greatest defense, was one-line stinging sarcasm. I could tear the flesh, and I could just rip you up, and it didn't show, and it didn't make you bleed, and I could deny it. And Sally would make some comment, and I would just give her a one-line stinging sarcasm. It would just almost knock her over, and then she invariably would always react the same way. She would say to me, do you mean that? And I would say, do I mean what? She'd say, you know. I said, no, I don't. She said, well, what you just said. And I said, what did I just say? Well, you know what you said. I said, now tell me what you think you thought you heard. And then she would tell me. And then I would really go into my alcoholic routine, and I would say, oh, God, you took it all wrong. I did not use that tone of voice. And if I could get her to talk to me long enough, invariably she would say to me, I'm so sorry for misunderstanding. Now, the insanity of that was we didn't do that once or twice. We did that week after week, month after month, year after year. So when we talk about the insanity in step 2, it's incredible. I had traveled for 2 weeks in Texas one time, and I got back to New York, and I was drunk, and I had leased a car and driven up to Connecticut. And when I got there, Sally was waiting for me. And when I walked through the back door that evening, there was a different appearance about Sally that night. And I remember kind of looking into her face, and she just turned to me and said, I can't live like this anymore. I'd rather be dead. And there was something different in the tone of her voice that night. And I said, hey, babe, we're all tired. I mean, it's been a long, tough trip for me, and let's get some sleep, and in the morning, it'll be different. And on a Saturday morning in Westport, Connecticut, the only girl that I've ever really loved said to me, I would rather be dead than live with you the way we're living. And there was a razor blade on top of our dresser, and I remember Sally kind of lunged for it and took it, and she headed for the master bath and told me she was going to cut her wrist. And I began to yell and say, my God, Sally, don't do that. You know, did my drinking bother you that much? I won't drink anymore. Just don't do that. Please don't kill yourself. And those four beautiful kids that I talked about were standing right behind me when I was yelling at their mother, please don't kill yourself. And I've been privileged to work with the Alateens in this program, and the Alateens have taught me a great deal about the disease of alcoholism. I was working with a 15-year-old boy that was getting beat up on a regular basis, and one night Jack got in my car, and I said to Jack, Jack, how are things going? And he said, they sound pretty good. And I said, what does that mean, Jack, they sound pretty good? And he said, well, the disease of alcoholism has a sound to it. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, that's how I defend myself. He said, I can put one foot in the home and determine the condition of the home immediately by the sound. There's either too much noise or there's no noise at all, or there's sarcasm or yelling or profanity or flesh hitting flesh or furniture hitting furniture. He said, depending upon the sound, that's how I defend myself. He said, if I hear the wrong noise, I go to my room, turn off the lights, turn up the stereo, and try and get lost. Oftentimes, I'll try and get a friend that I think might understand. Or if the pain is just too great, I move back out on the street because there's less pain on the street than there is in the home. A couple of weeks ago, Sally and I were privileged to talk with an Alateen that talked about the sound of silence, the killing sound of silence. And then this Jack said to me, he said, you know, Mr. Myers, if the sound of your house is the same today as it was a year ago, chances are you're not growing. And I thought, boy, how profound that is. I've had Alateen say to me, you know, my dad was profane when he was drinking. He's 2 years in the program, and he's still profane. When's he going to grow? And I have to say, I don't know. I went home and I told Sally about the sounds, and Sally and I started searching for the sounds that caused pain in our relationship and in our marriage. And some of them are very innocent. There's one in the program that you hear all the time that almost separated Sally and I in the very beginning. It's a very simple little phrase. That's your problem. Sally, early in our sobriety, said to me one night, that's your problem. Now, alcoholics are very sensitive. You know, we don't get angry, we just get even, and I just, okay. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and Sally finally made the mistake, and I said, and that's your problem. And I want to tell you that caused a lot of damage. I'll give you a very innocent one in sobriety. I would say to Sally on a Friday night, how'd you like to go out for dinner? And she'd say, I'd love it. And we would get in the front seat of the car, and we'd drive down the highway, and I would say to Sally, where would you like to go for dinner? And she would say, I don't care. And I would say to her, well, let's go over to Vincent's and get some seafood. She says, I don't feel like seafood. Well, let's go to the Split Rail and get some barbecue. I don't feel like barbecue. Now, I don't know about you. Alcoholics cannot handle rejection very well. And it was just a matter of seconds before I was saying to her, oh, damn it, and we'd be off to, and we'd fight. And I don't know how many hundreds and thousands of times we did that. You know, it says resentment is the number one offender. It kills more alcoholics than anything. And I really have to be careful that I don't bring resentment into my home and into my love for my wife. I managed to get my arms around Sally that morning, and we took her to a psychiatrist. I don't know how we figured that out. We took the wrong one to the psychiatrist for I don't know how long, on the premise that if we could get her fixed, I wouldn't drink. And I don't know how in the world we do that. And what the man said was, you're farm kids, you're from Iowa, and you're out of your element in this New England area, and you need to go back to Iowa where you belong, to be surrounded by family and friends and money stability, and stop traveling and get to know your kids. And you know, Sally and I put that all down on paper just like you'd build a house. And one more time we put the 4 kids and the dogs and the goldfish and all the rest in the station wagon. We headed for Iowa. And the only thing that we never saw was the disease of alcoholism. Used to be a fellow by the name of Bob White down in Whitney that said, you know, if you drink long enough in a strange way, they will show up in your living room. And he said, I call them they because I don't know where they come from, but they always show up when you need them the least. And I had become kind of a periodic drunk. It isn't that I didn't drink every day, I did, but every once in a while I would go to work and somebody would say, let's go to Chicago, and I would say, okay, and that would just sound wonderful to me at the time. Well, I did that one too many times, and when I got home, they were in the living room. And they said to me, you need to go to the alcohol and psychiatric clinic at the University of Iowa. And alcoholics are funny. When the evidence gets so tangible that you can't wiggle anymore, you begin to say funny things like, okay. God, on a Monday morning, I'm sitting at the alcohol and psychiatric clinic across from the psychiatrist that Sally and I had known socially, and John is talking to me, and he said, Albert, when you drink, you get in an awful lot of trouble anymore. And I said, yes, John, that's right. And he said, when you drink, you hurt people. And I said, I know. He said, let me tell you a little something about alcohol. He said, there are some people that are allergic to strawberries. When they eat them, they break out in a rash. Your problem is when you get an ounce of alcohol in you, you have hives of the brain. I said, God, John, I'm allergic to alcohol. He said, that's right. And he said, I recommend that you talk to a gentleman from Alcoholics Anonymous and that you go to an AA meeting. And in 1967, a marvelous man who is now dead by the name of Gil Voss took 3 hours out of a very busy Friday afternoon and talked to me about his drinking. He did exactly what it tells you to do in the big book, Working with Others. And he told me about the guilt and the shame and the degradation and the DWIs and the divorces and the separations and the harmed wives and kids and so on. And as he went down relating his story to me, my alcoholic mind was just up here saying, that hasn't happened, that hasn't happened, that hasn't happened. And I must not be alcoholic. I remember I went home and I told Sally, I said, you should have heard that story. God, it was terrible. I mean, if I get that bad, I'll join Alcoholics Anonymous. Or if I get as bad as your father, I'll join Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, Sally's dad came into the program in 1952, and he had 25 years of continuous sobriety before he passed away some 10 or 11 years ago. So Sally and I knew about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. As a matter of fact, when I finally made it in 1973, I said to Dad, Dad, my God, why didn't you say something to me about my drinking? I mean, I took all the things that you loved the most in this world. I took your daughter, and I took your love, and I took your money, and I took your booze, and I tried to take everything I could take from you. Not once did you ever talk to me about my drinking. And I remember this marvelous man with these just piercing blue eyes just softly looked at me and said, you would have resented it so much coming from me that it would have ruined the opportunity for the right person to reach you. And then he said something I've heard many times in the fellowship since then. You know, God made us all different, so we need each other. If he made us all the same, one of us wouldn't be necessary. But more than that, he's gifted each one of us with the ability to touch one other human being that nobody else can touch. And I'm willing to bet that almost everybody is here this morning because one other human being had the ability to reach in and touch you deeper than all the rest. If you heard Sally yesterday, she was vocal for 26 years, and she took her best shot. And she had some other people take their best shot. And one morning in a halfway house in Shreveport, Louisiana, a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor that I'd never seen before in my life said to me, you don't have to hurt anymore if you don't want to hurt anymore. And I haven't had a drink since. Don't you know that Sally went crazy for the first 24 hours trying to figure out what he said? I continued to drink periodically, and they showed up again, and they said, we're going to take your house, and we're going to sell it, and we're going to keep the equity. And I was saying funny things like, okay. And we're going to take the furniture out on the lawn, and we're going to auction it, and we're going to keep the equity. And I was saying, okay. And as I stand here this morning, you know, looking down at Sally and thinking of Sally and I and the 4 children standing on the lawn, the house is gone, the furniture's being auctioned off, and we never saw the disease of alcoholism. Sally never called me an alcoholic. The kids would graduate and go off to college, and I would think how wonderful, except they would never come back. The first opportunity they had to get out of the alcoholic home, they left. I remember one time I had a letter from my daughter, and there was a little passage in there that says, you'll always be my father, but my love for you will never be the same. And I remember I read that over and over again, thinking, my God, what have I done? I don't want to be the way I am. That just broke my heart. And I remember I just kept reading it over and over again. And the oldest drug hit the campus at Iowa in the late 60s. It was a very rebellious time and got into drugs and sold and jailed and trafficked. And the middle son does what they call an ACA, kind of the quiet child. He just backed out. There wasn't any conversation. It just seemed to me I came to the breakfast table one morning and Tom was gone. And John was too small and too young. He just couldn't get away from the house. And I used a friend and got a job in Shreveport, Louisiana, and John and Sally and I moved to Shreveport in 1972. And I drank pretty much around the clock, trying to exist from one day to the next. I would just get up in the morning and start drinking and hope I could finish out the day somewhere. And one night in a little area called Shreve Square down in Shreveport, Louisiana, I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw those red lights going around, and I thought, uh-oh. And I've heard about Caddo Parish police deputies, and they're mean guys, and I'll try to be ready for them when I get the car pulled over. And I remember just trying so delicately to get the car stopped, and these two Caddo Parish police deputies came around to the side of the car, and I rolled the window down, and they said, "Could we have your driver's license?" And I said, "Sure." And I just handed it to them. And then I made a bad error. I rolled up the window and drove off and left them standing there. That's not a good move. That makes them very mad. And the second time they got the car stopped, there wasn't any dialogue. Just the door flew open, and they pulled the body out, and they threw me over the hood, and I remember the handcuffs going up the back, and my alcoholic mind is saying, "God, I hope nobody's watching this." You know how And we get down to the jail cell there on Texas Avenue in Shreveport, and they're doing all the things they need to do for DWIs, and I'm waving at the guys and the gals. "You're having a good time." And one of them said, "We're going to have to put you in a cell." I said, "Terrific." Yeah. I remember they kind of shoved me in there head first, going this direction. As I turned around, the bars were coming together, and that sound that God created for us when the bars hit. And for a second, I saw myself on top of the glass building in New York overlooking Central Park to the jail cell in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I thought, damn, got a problem. And the man said you could call. And I didn't know who to call. People that had loved me said, "Just don't call. We don't care." And being a good salesman, I called my best customer. I mean, that's what salesmen do when they're in jail and don't have any place else to go. And I want to tell you, God works in strange ways, because Frank is not in the program. And Frank came down and got me out of jail, and I remember we got in the front seat of the car, and I said to Frank, "Let's go get a six-pack and straighten this out." And he said, "No, you come to my house, and in the morning we'll try to figure out what to do with you." And I thought, God, try to figure out what to do with me. And I'm motivated by my good intentions. You just judge me on my actions. I mean, I wanted to say, "Can't you see, what I'm trying to do?" And I remember I stayed at Frank's house that night, and I watched a big clock in the kitchen. It was just a big clock, and it got to exactly 6 o'clock, and I called an Episcopal priest, and I said, "Father Paul, this is Albert, and I am in big trouble." And he said, "Can you get down to the church?" And I said, "Yes, Father, I can." And I got down there, and we began to talk that morning. He said, "Albert, I want you to go to this halfway house. It's called the Bridge House on Stoner Avenue." And he said, "There's a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor down there that I think you can relate to." And I'm thinking, how in the world could I relate to a 74-year-old retired electrical contractor in a halfway house? I mean, I'm a high-class guy. God, I think it's Hal M. that says some of us get here because they see the light, others get here because they feel the heat. And that morning the heat was on, and I was saying funny things like, "Okay." And I went down to this halfway house, and a table much like this, and they sat me at the end there, and there were 3 old railroad guys. I mean, I've heard some of the others speak. I mean, you talk about old. These guys were ancient and dusted. They were just... And we were sitting around, and one of them said to me, "When did you have your last drink?" And I just remember this volcanic eruption, and I started to cry, and I pounded on the table, and I said, "I got these $1,200 worth of hot checks, and the house is gone, and the furniture's gone, and 3 of the 4 kids are gone, and Sally wants to leave, and I'm about to get fired, and they're trying to pick up the car." And one of them turned to the other one and said, "God, he sure sounds like one of us." One of them said to me, "Would you do anything to get sober?" I said, "I'll do anything." And the guy said, "Would you go to 7 meetings in a row?" God, 7 meetings in a row. I mean, 50 miles in the snow to get a drink, but 7 meetings in a row. God, I looked around, and there those dumb slogans were on the wall. And I had seen those in Sally's dad's house, and I said, these guys are talking about Alcoholics Anonymous. And God, I started to get up out of the chair, and this marvelous old man put his arm around me, and he touched me that morning. I can still feel his touch. You know, it wasn't the 12 steps on the wall that saved my life. It was the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous carved in this man's life that I could touch and see and feel that morning. And he was kind of taking me by the hand, and he said, Albert, we need to go for a ride. He said, I have to go over to Shumpert Hospital and visit this friend of mine in the alcoholic ward. And I thought, man, he's just checking me in. I know what he's doing. And we got in the front seat of the car, and we started towards the hospital, and this is what he said. You know, Albert, I never did quit drinking. And that's all he said. He didn't say any more. He didn't say anything. I started thinking about that. Yeah, the priest is right. I can really relate to this guy. And I don't know how he's doing that, but I love the cure. We got over to the hospital, and we talked to his friend, and he didn't check me in. I met a Sister Germaine that morning, and on the way back to the halfway house, one more time, he said to me, you know, Albert, I never did quit drinking. As a matter of fact, I may have a drink tomorrow. I said, Bill, how long have you been doing that? He said, what's that, Albert? I said, that not quit drinking. He said, 27 years, but I may have a drink tomorrow. He said, you know, nobody ever took my right to drink away from me. I don't know what I thought you were going to take. You know, we alcoholics have a hold of this rock, and we're going to the bottom of the lake, and everybody around us is saying, let go of the rock. And we're saying, hell no, you know, it's mine. I said, but Bill, you'll take away my freedom. God, and this pathetic glaze just come over his face. He said, sure, freedom? He said, let's talk a little bit about freedom. He said, I have this dog that I put out in the backyard every day. It's fenced in, and he plays, and he barks at the birds, and he soaks up the sunshine, and he has plenty to eat and drink. At night, I come home, pick it up, take it in the house, and love it. Now, he said, I could let that dog be perfectly free and open up the back gate. And it could get out, maybe get run over by a truck, go without food and starve, picked up by somebody that doesn't love it as much as I do. He said, it seems to me of the two freedoms, I'd rather be the dog on the inside of the fence. He said, you can be as big and as free as you want as long as you stay on the framework and the inside of the principles of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I said, Bill, God, I'm a salesman, Bill. And I got to go back out there, and they're still out there. And somebody's going to ask me to have a drink, and I won't know what to tell them. He said, you want to know what to tell him? I said, God, yes. He said, why don't you try the truth? You haven't tried that in a long time. I said, Bill, I don't understand that. He said, I know you don't, Albert. It's been so long since you've dealt in the areas of honesty, you don't know what that is anymore. You know, when they read how it works in the 5th chapter, in the first 2 paragraphs, there are 3 references to honesty. Those of us that don't make it are those that can't get completely honest with themselves in this simple program. As a matter of fact, there are 11 references to honesty in the 5th chapter. And this is what Bill told me. He said, if somebody asks you to have a drink, tell them you can't drink that stuff. It gets you drunk. I said, is that it? He said, yes, that's it. He said, you do understand when they drink it, it gets them drunk. I said, well, I never really thought about it. Now, I want to tell you, up here, like so many things I heard in the beginning, I said, that will never work. My work for you, that'll never work for me. We're like 90 days in the program. We've moved to Dallas. An ex-Dallas Cowboy football player that was selling radio media in the off-season came to my office. We went to a place called the Hungry Hunter. Went right up to the bar, and Dave said to me, Albert, would you like to have a drink? I said, oh, God, Dave can't drink that stuff. It gets me drunk. He said, oh, geez, don't drink it. I said, okay, I won't. I think it tells the sea that says we wouldn't worry nearly so much about what people thought about us if we realized how little they didn't. This old man said, you'll come to the halfway house every morning at 10:30, and I said, yes, sponsor. And we started working the steps of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous at 10:30 every morning in the halfway house. And the old man said to me, you're not going to travel anymore. I said, Bill, what am I going to do? He said, you're going to sell used cars. I said, I've never sold used cars. He said, you're going to start. And I said, yes, sponsor. And I want to tell you, every day that man came to see me at that parking lot. He came to see me. Are you okay? And I said, you bet. And then he'd drive off. One day he said to me, you're going to have to get a sponsor that you can relate to. I said, Bill, won't you be my sponsor? He said, I'll always be your sponsor. But he said, you need to have somebody that you can relate to talk to every day. He said, there's a fellow by the name of Hoss Ross that travels on the road for RCA, and he stays sober. I said, you got to be kidding. He travels on the road and he stays sober? Yeah. Did you ever notice who we turn our life over to in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous? On a Thursday night in Shreveport at the Highland Club, I'm looking for a fellow by the name of Hoss Ross. Now, Hoss came through the side door. He's about 6'3", weighs 145 pounds, and he dresses all in one color. You've seen a couple of my wardrobes. And I want to tell you, I went over to Hoss, and I said, Hoss, I understand that you travel on the road for RCA and you stay sober. He said, that's right, son. I said, I've been told by Bill that you would be a good sponsor for me. Would you be my sponsor? He said, son, I'll be honored. He said, you have one of them big books? I said, not of my own. And I remember he took me over and he bought me this big book, and he wrote in the cover, to a long life in the fellowship, Hoss Ross. And we went and signed a card that night to the Highland group. And I became a member and a part of something. And I want to tell you, Hoss called me every single night, and he'd say, what are you doing, son? And I'd say, nothing, Hoss. He said, I'll be right over. God, about 2 weeks, I told Sally, I said, man, I've made a mistake here. I can't shake this turkey. And one night he called, he said, what are you doing, son? I said, Hoss, I'm going to be busy tonight. He said, good, I'll do it with you. I tell you, sponsors talk to you funny. I said to Hoss one night, I said, okay, Hoss, I'm going to admit my life is unmanageable. What are you going to do with it? He said, I'm going to turn it over to a bunch of people that can't manage theirs. I started thinking about that. You know, that's what we do. I said, Hoss, how do you hang on? He said, oh, that's easy. You just let go. I want to tell you, I stopped asking him questions. On December the 7th of 1973, Sally and I drove to Dallas, Texas with one son who was so angry that he didn't want to be with us. And I was driving a car that was co-signed by my sponsor. I was going to a job that was arranged by my sponsor. And I had money in my pocket to buy groceries from my sponsor. And Sally and I had each other, and we weren't too crazy about that. And I remember we got to Dallas, Texas, and we didn't know a soul. And we found a little club called Alpha. Matter of fact, John used to keep a loaded shotgun for us in the bedroom, and when Sally and I would go in to see how he was, he'd just put his hand on the shotgun, and we had to send him back to Shreveport to live with a family for the first 6 months so Sally and I could get it started. We worked for a long time on the principles and the steps of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Sally very active in Al-Anon. By the way, you know, Sally's not an Al-Anon because she's married to an alcoholic or to a drunk. She's an Al-Anon because she's very active in Al-Anon, and she goes to the Al-Anon meetings, and she brings the principles of Al-Anon in our home and into our love for each other and into the healing process of the family. And every once in a while I hear somebody get identified that they're an Al-Anon because they're married to a drunk or an alcoholic, and that's just not so. Not at our house, anyway. Having been in the program for about 2 years, and one weekend we were looking at houses, and that's what alcoholics do that don't have any money. They look at houses or pictures. And we were looking at this townhouse, and this lady says it's only $50,000, 5% down, 8 3/4% interest, 30-year loan. And Sally and I had laughed and giggled because we had tried to cash a check the day before, and somebody had asked for $200, and I was lucky to have a driver's license. And I remember I called my sponsor. It was on a Sunday night, and I called Bill, and I said, Bill, you'll never guess what Sally and I were doing today. He said, what's that, Albert? I said, we were looking at houses. He said, tell me a little bit about that. And after a while, he said, would you like to buy that house? And I said, well, of course. He said, well, you haven't forgotten about honesty yet, have you? And I said, no. He said, well, write a letter. I said, to who? He said, the loan committee that lady was talking about. Did you ever notice how we alcoholics are scared to death of losing something we don't own anyway? And Bill said, what you do is you write this letter and you say your name is and you work for this company and this is your area of responsibility and this is what you make and you're a very active member of the Alpha Group, Alcoholics Anonymous, Dallas, Texas. And Sally works for this group of doctors and this is her area of responsibility and this is what she makes and she's a very active member of the Alpha Group, Al-Anon Family Group, Alpha, Dallas, Texas. And we wrote this letter just like my sponsor suggested and outlined for us. And on a Monday morning, Sally and I drove up in front of a little loan place. It was Oak Cliff Savings and Loan. And I remember we got so quiet in the front seat of the car, and Sally and I held hands and did what it tells you to do in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we said out loud together, God, I offer myself to Thee to build with me and to do with me as Thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do Thy will. Take away my difficulties that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. May I do Thy will always. And there was a quietness in the front seat that morning, and something that Sally and I hadn't experienced in a long time. The fear was gone, and it was okay. And we had that feeling that whatever happened to us that morning would be all right. And I remember we went in, we sat down in front of this little loan officer, and to this day I don't like loan forms because the first question on there is if you've lived there for less than a year, list below, and alcoholics always put C attached. We've moved around a lot. I love it. I think it's Clancy that says, have you ever seen an alcoholic resume? It's just full of holes that say self-employed. We can't get it all covered up. And we got down to where it had money and credit, and I said to the man, we don't have any money and we don't have any credit, but we have this letter. And I remember Sally and I handed him this letter, and we said, give it to the loan committee, and you let them decide whether we should be a part of your community or not. And I suppose it was 3 or 4 weeks later they called and said, come get your $50,000. And Sally and I have been very privileged to sponsor a lot of people in the program. And I have people that say to me, I can't get it started. I can't get any credit. I can't get a car. I can't get a boat. I can't get any house. I can't buy any land. And I always say to them, hey, write a letter. And they say, that'll never work. I said, I know, but write it anyway. And in time, they always call us and say, we just got our boat. We just got our car. We just got our house. And this is because an old-timer in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous told us how to reconstruct our life. I want to tell you, I've had a lot of problems in society. In my 12th year, I went absolutely crazy. In AA Comes of Age, I think around page 245, Dr. Tebow says, regardless of our veteran status in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, at any time the disease of alcoholism can return, and normally it's in the form of halotosis. And I had a little of that ism return, and I was going crazy, and I looked at some business ventures that I thought were good, and they weren't. And I had some people around me that said, hey, I don't think you should be hooked up with that personality in the program. You're not compatible with him. And I thought up here, well, I'm so wonderful, and, if they just knew how wonderful I am, they wouldn't talk to me like that. And I was just going crazy in my 12th year of sobriety. And I had reason to be up in Prince Albert, and I was talking to Cease, and I remember just like this very moment, Cease and I were in the car. Yeah, we were going down, and I was telling Cease, I said, Cease, my God, I'm going crazy. I'm doing some things that, making some decisions that I shouldn't. And Cease said, talk to me a little bit about that, Albert. And we talked for a while, and out of nowhere, Cease said to me, he said, Albert, it isn't that you're doing anything wrong, it's that you're not doing some things at all. I said, Cease, what does that mean? And he started reeling it off, and he said, do you remember when you first came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, how bad you felt? And I said, yeah. And he said, we're very serious about the program, and we're not very serious about the personality. He said, in time we start to get serious about the personality, and we don't get so serious about the program. He said, I'll bet you don't read your 24-hour book every day the way you used to. He said, I'll bet you don't read pages 86 and 87 anymore. I'll bet you don't pray the way you used to. Bet you don't meditate the way you used to. I'd even be willing to bet you don't sponsor your home group as good as you used to. And I want to tell you, Cease just kept going down and nicking my heart. And he was right. I forgot to protect the thing that was protecting me. And Cease said to me, sometimes, Albert, we get so busy picking up the pieces that we drop the program. And in my 12th year of sobriety, thank God for the old-timer, thank God for the Ceases that are here in this program that say to you, hey, this is where you're going, young man. You better move back over here to the basics. And I want to thank Cease for saving my life. Sally and I were chairing a meeting one night, and a man came in, obviously had a real problem. He was flushed in the face, and Sally, out of courtesy, said to this man, you know, is there anything anybody would like to talk about tonight? And boy, his hand went straight up in the air. He said, I'd like to talk about something. So I just got out of this treatment center, and I got this crazy wife and these 4 kids, and God, if I could just get them straightened out, I'd be okay. For about an hour, we tried to get a net over him, you know. At the end of the meeting, I went over and I said, my name's Albert. He said, my name's Jim. I said, what do you do, Jim? He said, I'm regional manager for Owens Corning Fiberglass. I said, oh, God, you wouldn't, you know. And we started to talk, and I became his friend and his sponsor. And one day we were talking. Jim said, why don't you come back to work for Owens Corning Fiberglass? I said, oh, Jim, I said, you don't know. Up there in my folder, there's a little card that says, don't ever let this guy back. And Jim says, no, we've changed our posture on that. He said, we have a very active employees assistance program, and of the 24,000 employees in Owens Corning Fiberglass, over 1,900 of them are in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, why don't you write a letter? I did. I wrote a letter, and I knew who to write to, and I said, dear guy, Jim and I are talking about this, and the possibility of it would be more than I would pray for. But if it's possible, you know, let me know. And in a short period of time, they called back and said, send a resume. And I knew they had one, so I just gave them an AA resume, you know, the driving while intoxicated, jail, Shreveport jail, fired from last job, sold used cars too much. I just sent it back up to Toledo. And within a short period of time, they said, could you come up for interviews? And I said, sure. And I went up there, and the first meeting I had that day, there are certain questions that they're supposed to ask, but this little fellow sat down. He had this kind of strange smile, and he said, I'm not here to ask you any questions this morning. He said, but I've been dying to meet you. He said, of all the years I've been with Owens Corning Fiberglass, I've never seen a resume where a guy starts out in jail. You know, the one ingredient that had plagued me all of my life was gone that morning, the fear. You know, I knew who I was and what I was, and he knew who I was and what I was. And I love what it says in the big book on page 83. It says, you know, I'm a child of God, and I don't have to crawl before anybody anymore. And that morning I was there, and I was home, and it was okay. My last interview was with a man that had been my branch manager some 20 years prior, and this is the way the interview went. He said, Albert, how's Sally and the kids? I said, terrific. How's Marion and your kids? He said, super. You ready to come back to work? And I said, you bet. And they bridged 20-some years and took me back to work with Owens Corning Fiberglass. I worked for him for about a year, and I had a heart attack. I'd been playing racquetball, and I didn't realize that I had it because I didn't have any of the symptomatic pains that go with heart attacks. I just had a little pull in my shoulder on the back side, and the following day I went to work, and I had a business luncheon that day, and that evening Sally and I went out for dinner, and as the evening progressed, the pain began to pull a little bit under my shoulder blade, and I told Sally, I said, run me down to Presbyterian Hospital, and we'll just check to make sure. And during the examination, you know, all of a sudden this guy said, you're going to feel better with these hoses up your nose and this IV in your arm and this nitro under your tongue, and I had shut down the whole right coronary area, and I didn't know it, and they had taken me up to intensive care, and if you know anything about coronary care units, they're very rigid, and they're little bronze plaques on the wall that say, visit family only, limit 2 people, limit time 2 minutes. And Sally and one of the sons had just come in and out, and I was wired up, and I'm going in and out of the oxygen. And just as they left, all of a sudden I looked up, and here's this beautiful black guy that I sponsor standing at the end of my bed. And I said to Bob, I said, Bob, how the hell did you get in here? He said, I told him I was family. I said, what else did you tell him? He said, I told him you were my father. You know, we really are family. I am so blessed to have a place where I can come ventilate my disease, because I tell you what, I hide from the rest of the world. I had a second heart attack and didn't have any pain with it. It was just a routine examination, and they discovered some scar tissue on the EKG, and they sent me to a cardiologist, and I sat down with him, and he said, we're going to have to do an angiogram on you because you can't monitor your disease. And I said, yeah, I've had that problem once before. And So they did the angiogram and said, well, we're going to have to do a triple bypass. You know, alcoholics want to negotiate a little bit. I remember saying to the surgeon, what's the alternative? He said, you'll die. I said, oh, okay, well. And I've said this many times from the podium, but I don't advocate open heart surgery for an in-depth third step. But I will tell you this, the night before open heart surgery, you will know that you're not running anything. The third step prayer is very important to you at that time. And the seventh step prayer, which Doug talked so beautifully about in his talk last night. And I remember over and over again the night before open heart surgery being able to say in the calmness of my own presence, my Creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. And Sally and I have come to find out that there's very little that happens in our life that we can't take care of with your love and your strength and the principles of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. The daughter was having problems in her relationship not too many years ago, and she called down and said, Dad, could I come to Texas and bring the grandson? I'm having a little problem. And I said, sure, honey, when are you coming? And she told me the weekend, and I said, sweetie, you may want to pick another weekend. Mom's going to be up in Oklahoma to Heart that weekend. And she said, no, Dad, I think I'd like to come down and be with you. I said, terrific, come on down. And I'm still a father that's plagued with a great deal of guilt, and I want to buy tangible things to give it to you, to tell you that I'm really sorry for what I've done. And Roxy knows that. And when we go shopping, she's very careful not to point, so, you know, because Daddy's trying to get it for her. But we were shopping around this very nice shopping center called North Park, and I said to Roxy, I said, hey, I see in this morning's paper where Mel Torme and George Shearing are playing down at the Fairmont. How'd you like to have a night on the town with your dad? And she said, I would just love that. And I remember we made arrangements for a babysitter, and Roxy and I got all gussied up that night and went down to this very fancy hotel, and the maitre d' took us to our table, and the music began to play, and as I said to my girl, would you like to dance? And I remember holding her just, you know, right this very moment as we're dancing. You know, I heard Roxy say to me, you're just the greatest dad in all the world. You know, I don't know of anybody more wonderful than you. And, you know, she was telling me what I had waited a lifetime to hear. And don't you know how grateful I was to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that night that had given me my girl back. The oldest son, who got into the drugs and jailed and trafficked and so on, was having a terrible time. I can't tell you why. He just couldn't seem to stay out of jail. I remember they called one time, and he was in jail on 2 counts of criminal mischief. And I said to Sally, my God, when is he ever going to stay out of jail? I mean, he's 34 years old. I didn't stay out till I was 46, but... But he just kept having problems, and for 12 years, the guilt that I had on the inside of me just, enabled me to do the wrong thing. He'd need money, and I'd send money, and I just kept him crippled for a long time. And a couple months after the last call, they called one day, and they said, hey, he's in jail for criminal harassment this time, and the bail was set at $5,000, and they put Chuck on the phone, and we started to talk. And I can't tell you why, out of nowhere, I just said to Chuck, Chuck, I don't want to play anymore. I mean, I care, but I don't care. And I don't know how you got in, and I don't know how you're going to get out, but I'm just not going to play anymore. And I remember I put the phone down so quietly and so softly, and when I put the phone down, God, my heart was broken. And I just like Sally talked about, my emotions were frozen, and I couldn't think, and I didn't know who to talk to. And I called on Al-Anon, and I said, God, Vanoy, I've just said no to my son for the first time in 12 years, and my heart is broken. And she said, of course it is, Albert. You're a father. But she said, you got to work the steps. I said, damn it, Vanoy, I know the steps. And she said, yeah, Albert, but you're not working them. You got to take step one. Let me hear you say out loud, you're powerless over your son, and he makes your life unmanageable. And I had intellectualized that 1,000 times, but in my heart I hadn't said it, and I said it out loud. I'm powerless over my son, and he makes my life unmanageable. And a power greater than yourself is going to restore him to sanity. That's right, a power greater than myself is going to restore him to sanity. And you're going to turn his will and his life over to the care of God as you understand him. That's right, I'm going to turn his will and his life. And then she said, write down a couple of things that make you feel guilty about your son. Now, I didn't even hesitate. I remember I just took the pencil out, and the first thing I wrote was, made him do things that he didn't want to do when he was small. I mean, I wanted him to be a competitor and be in athletics, and God had gifted him as an artist and a poet and a journalist. I remember I used to take Chuck, and I'd get so angry, and I'd just shove him right up against the wall, and his eyeballs would get that big, and I'd say, by God, you just get your hair cut, if you just get your room picked up, if you just get to school on time, if you just do what I tell you, you could be just like me. God, and he used to look out and say, I'll do anything but be like you. I remember one time I had him pinned up there, and he just looked me straight in the eye so quietly, and he said, you're insane. I said, how dare you talk to me like that? I buy the clothes, I buy the grocery, I pay the rent. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have what you have. And I want to tell you, he left. It took a long time for that relationship to heal. You know, we hurt each of the children differently, and they all heal differently. And last Father's Day, just a few weeks back, I got a card from Chuck. On the front, there was a big monkey that was kind of dressed up like Humphrey Bogart. And as you opened it up, there was a caption in there that says, here's looking at you, kid. And down below, he signed it Chuck, and he put P.S. I'm so proud of you for what you've done with your life. You've certainly given me something to live up to. I love you, Chuck. The middle son, who just moved away, lives down in Houston, and he loves to be with Sally and I. And whenever he can, he comes up to play golf, or we go fishing, and we've got a couple of little business things together. And once in a while, he just calls and says, I love you, Pop. And the young guy that used to keep the loaded shotgun for Sally and I called me a couple of years ago and said, Dad, can we play some golf? And I said, sure. And afterwards, he said, I need to talk a little bit. And I said, okay. He said, Dad, sometimes I find myself drinking with people that I don't want to be with. Did that ever happen to you? Once or twice. He said, sometimes I find myself drinking in places that I don't want to be. Did that ever happen to you? And I said, a couple times. He said, sometimes I start out the night with $200 or $300, and in the morning I only have 10 or 20, and I don't know where the money went. Did that ever happen to you? And I said, sure. And he said, what do you think? And I said, about what? Do you want me to think that you have a drinking problem? If do, let me tell you what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to do for you what Sally's dad did for me. I'm going to give you the names of 2 people in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to give you their home phone, and I'm going to give you their business phone. And you know both of these gentlemen. And if the pain in your life gets so bad you can't handle it anymore, you call them. They have a way out. I'm your father, and I would either cripple you or kill you, because I can't seem to help you without a certain amount of expectations. Where it says working with others in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, I can look directly at your kids, and I can accept it, and I can react to it correctly. But when I try to work with my own, I cannot get the acceptance without expectations. But I've come to live and sleep and be very, very comfortable in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, knowing one thing for sure. I'll save your kids, and you save mine.